Hello, welcome to this session titled, What is the research support for the science of reading's position on the use of contextual supports in word identification and word learning? My name is Joanne Lim, and I'm a vice president at Hager Sharp, a communications firm based in Washington, D.C. I've worked on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, with the National Center for Education Statistics for more than a decade, supporting the program in strategic communications. I'm very proud to be involved in this Reading Day event to highlight important reading data and findings across America. I will be moderating the Q&A portion after the session and will take questions from the chat space, so please make sure that you type your questions there. The presenter of the session is Dr. Donna Scanlon, whom I will be introducing. Dr. Scanlon is Professor Emeritus at the University of Albany's Department of Literacy, Teaching, and Learning, and she was affiliated with the university's Child Research and Study Center for more than 40 years, serving as associate director at different points. She's also a former IES grant recipient. Dr. Scanlon's research and teaching focused on the characteristics of children who experience substantial difficulty in learning to read and on how to prevent and remediate reading difficulties. She and her colleagues developed an approach to early literacy instruction and intervention called the Interactive Strategies Approach, which was found to be effective in reducing the incidence of reading difficulties in the primary grades. She will now be presenting on what is the research support for the science of reading's position on the use of contextual supports in word identification and word learning. This session has been pre-recorded, and I will join you all live for the Q&A at the end of her presentation. I will now hand this over to Dr. Scanlon.
So the topic of my session today is what is the research support for the SOR's position on the use of contextual supports in word identification and word learning. My goal in this session is to share some of the thinking that colleagues and I have been doing as the Science of Reading, or the SOR campaign, appears to be trying to take center stage in efforts to reduce the incidence of reading difficulties. The SOR proponents are trying to strongly alter the way early literacy learners learn about written language, both in terms of the amount and type of instruction they receive in relation to the alphabetic code, and in terms of the guidance and support they receive in relation to attempting to identify unfamiliar words encountered while reading. These two foci are strongly related in that phonologically based decoding, without reference to contextual information or supports, is being offered as the way to reduce the incidence of reading difficulties. Ever since the SOR movement began to gain prominence in the media and ultimately began to influence educators' thinking about reading difficulties, I've been trying to track down the evidence that supports their opposition to the use of contextual supports in word identification. My search of the research literature has not yielded any support for this position. Moreover, I have submitted several requests for evidence in support of the SOR position to the National Council on Teacher Quality, which strongly supports the SOR position on the use of context. I've had no response. This is concerning because, as some of you know, the NCTQ has taken upon itself the mission of rating teacher education programs and texts on literacy instruction used in those programs. So the answer to the question on the screen is none. Why then, you may be wondering, would I offer to talk on this topic? The answer is that the prohibition on teaching or encouraging learners to use context has the potential to seriously limit children's ability to become proficient readers because context plays such a vital role in word solving, particularly in a language like English, in which a substantial proportion of written words are not fully decodable. In addition, encouraging the use of context essentially encourages a focus on meaning construction, which is, of course, the reason we read, and limitations in reading comprehension are, of course, the most critical outcome of concern with regard to reading. Currently, there are well-organized and passionate groups who identify themselves as being proponents of basing early literacy instruction on the science of reading. They're getting a lot of attention from the popular press with limited pushback. There are, of course, many in the scientific community, including me, who object to the SOR's claims that they are articulating what the scientific research on reading shows or dictates. I use the name they identify with during this talk, both for convenience purposes and because the SOR movement is, at least for now, tightly associated with the assertions they make. So the SOR proponents argue for an approach to reading instruction and intervention especially the word reading aspect of the reading process that does not reflect theory, research, and logic with regard to the word reading, word learning aspect of literacy development. In fact, SOR proponents, at least as their position is represented in the popular press, argue that we have settled science when it comes to appropriate approaches to teaching about the word reading aspect of reading. It's widely agreed that fast and accurate word identification enables comprehension, and comprehension is, of course, the goal of reading and reading instruction. So helping learners to develop an extensive body of words that they can read effortlessly is important. The estimates are that proficient readers can effortlessly identify in excess of 40,000 words. Obviously, there's no way to teach that huge number of words. Rather, the vast majority of the words that become part of a reader's sight vocabulary are learned through effective word solving while reading. Essentially, learners engage in word solving in context. That word solving, if it's successful, leads to word identification, and that word identification, over time, leads to word learning. So there's a major concern relative to the SOR proponents' argument that learners should not be taught or encouraged to use contextual information in attempting to solve unfamiliar words that they encounter while reading. They argue that learners should rely exclusively, or nearly so, on alphabetic and orthographic information in efforts to solve unfamiliar words encountered in text, and they argue that the scientific evidence supports their position, but it doesn't. In fact, neither theory nor research supports the heavy emphasis on phonics instruction, nor the opposition to the use of contextual information. The SOR proponents reference the National Reading Panel report to support their position both on the importance of a heavy, near-exclusive focus on phonics and word solving, and on the use of context as an assistant in word solving. From the report, we learned that explicit teaching of phonics skills has no more than a moderate effect on reading growth. Nevertheless, the SOR proponents use this 20-year-old report to justify their position for a very heavy emphasis on phonics instruction. In the report, there is no mention of the utility of the use of contextual information, and that's largely because there's not been enough research that addresses the question in a real-world setting. The National Reading Panel stated pretty explicitly that phonics should be a part, but not the major focus of a comprehensive literacy program. Nevertheless, the SOR proponents are asserting and making phonological awareness and phonics instruction a much more prominent part of early literacy instruction. In terms of theoretical positions, one important example is David Scher's self-teaching hypothesis that proposes that most words that a proficient reader can read are not directly taught, but are learned through effective word solving while reading. Scher referred to this process as self-teaching. Basically, his argument is that learners use the alphabetic and orthographic information they have in combination with context in which an unknown word is encountered to puzzle through and identify words. Research since the 1995 publication has not refuted this hypothesis, and other literacy researchers as far back as the 1970s, Gibson and Levin, for example, have taken a similar position and argued that part of the process of word solving involves being flexible in one's decoding attempts. If a first attempt doesn't result in a word that fits the context, the reader needs to try different pronunciations for some of the letters. Other empirical and theoretical work that recognizes and supports the role played by context in word solving is also available. For example, my colleague Frank Valentino and I described the theory and logic for an intervention program that we developed that was successful in reducing the number of kids who experienced reading difficulties. Linnea Airy's work, for example, her 2005 piece on learning to read words, also supports the use of context in word solving, at least for children at the beginning stages of the literacy development process. So I want to spend some time talking about some of the reasons why the use of context in combination with phonics and code-based information supports word identification and word learning. So we know that most of the words that a reader can read are learned through effective word solving while reading. In our work with teachers, this is an area which we've which we emphasize strongly because it has extremely important implications in terms of what we teach and how we respond to students' word-solving efforts. For example, if a child is puzzled by an unfamiliar word encountered while reading, if the teacher routinely just provides the word, the child may not analyze or look at the word thoroughly enough to store the printed version of the word in memory with enough detail to make the word more recognizable or accessible on subsequent encounters. As another example, if the reader is puzzling over a word and the teacher assists by saying something like, "It rhymes with," that may serve to help the reader identify the word in that particular context, but the prompt is not likely to prove to be generative, helping the reader to solve different words in different contexts in the future. So in order to learn to read printed words to the point where they can be identified automatically and effortlessly, learners must store detailed representations of their alphabetic and orthographic characteristics. Teacher guidance around word solving in context would ideally be responsive, however, to what the reader knows and is able to do, encouraging the application of known phonics skills, drawing attention to context if it's helpful, and over time, adjusting the guidance such that the reader becomes more and more effective at relying on alphabetic and orthographic information. Phonics and decoding skills enable the readers to derive at least an approximation of the pronunciation of unfamiliar printed words. Contextual information allows the reader to confirm a word's identity, and contextual and code-based information need to be used in interactive and confirmatory ways. Readers often need to check multiple sources of available information against one another in order to settle on a word's identity. So we're beginning to touch on some of the reasons why the use of context in combination with phonics and code-based information supports word identification and word learning. One thing, as already briefly noted, there are many words in printed English that cannot be accurately decoded based on knowledge of the code alone. Therefore, exclusive reliance on the code limits word-solving accuracy and thereby the growth in sight vocabulary. Some high-frequency words, for example, cannot be fully decoded, and there are lots of other words that are not quite so high frequency. Consider, for example, these three words. Phonics instruction would not equip a reader to accurately identify the first two of these, nor the third, if it was referring to a type of bird. As another example, consider the words bread, break, and speak, in which the EA combination is pronounced differently in each word. There are, of course, more reasons why the use of context in combination with phonics or code-based information supports word identification and word learning. For one thing, the use of context in combination with the code allows readers to direct and check their decoding attempts. But of course, encouraging learners to attend to the code-based information they are prepared to handle increases the likelihood that word-solving efforts will be successful and that words will be more readily identified on subsequent encounters. And just to drill down a little bit more on the notion of set for variability, it's clear that many irregular words can be accurately identified if the reader modifies attempted pronunciations by changing the sounds of some of the letters or letter patterns. Such changes would be prompted by a realization on the reader's part that the attempted pronunciation is not a real word or is not a word that makes sense in the context in which it was encountered, and would be enabled by the reader's flexibility in modifying the initial pronunciation, which, at least in part, is likely to be influenced by context. So being able to do so involves recognizing that there is variability in the spellings of spoken words, such that they are not always spelled exactly by how they sound. In this next slide, I provide a simplified depiction of what the word-solving, word-learning process might be like for a reader, especially one who often encounters unfamiliar printed words while reading connected text. In this first box, we represent a reader encountering an unfamiliar printed word in context. The learner who has some skill with the alphabetic code understands that reading is about meaning construction would engage in an analysis of the alphabetic, orthographic, and contextual information provided by the word in the text. The relative emphasis on these different sources of information would depend both on the text and the reader's knowledge and skills. The outcome of this would ideally enable the reader to determine a likely or possible pronunciation of the unfamiliar word. Once that pronunciation has been derived, the reader would go on to consider whether the word is part of their spoken vocabulary. That is it a word they know? Basically, unless a word is part of a reader's spoken vocabulary, the reader cannot be certain that a word has been accurately identified. If the answer to this question is yes, the next question that the reader would consider, either explicitly or implicitly, would be, does the word make sense in the current context? Answering this question would certainly require to think back on what's been read so far, but may also require the reader to read past the puzzling word for more contextual information. If the answer to this question is yes, the reader is likely to confirm the identity of the word and continue reading. When a word is confirmed as being accurately identified, it helps to boost the familiarity of that word such that the word is more likely to be readily identified on subsequent encounters. That is, it's on the way to becoming part of the reader's sight vocabulary. Of course, if the answer to the question, is it a word I know, is no, then ideally the reader would reconsider some of the orthographic and contextual information and potentially arrive at an alternative pronunciation, essentially invoking the set for variability. The outcome of that would once again need to be checked against the learner's spoken vocabulary. If the answer at this point is yes, the reader would go on to the next step, again considering whether the word makes sense in context, and if so, confirming the word. If the answer to that question is no, again, the reader might reevaluate the contextual and orthographic information to try another pronunciation. I'm next going to share a couple of brief video clips that illustrate some of the things we've just been talking about in terms of the word solving and word identification process. The clips are of a fourth grade student involved in one of our one-to-one intervention studies. The first video was recorded in one of the early intervention sessions. In this clip, it's evident that the student seems to be making little effort to integrate multiple sources of information in efforts to solve unfamiliar words. What he reads often doesn't make sense. Therefore, an early goal of our intervention efforts was to encourage monitoring for sense-making.
In the Green Valley, were like this. There was a promising and clean. That does not make sense. The people would wear their sandals in the Windward Valley. The headless. That does not make sense.
This next video was recorded several weeks into the intervention. The reader at that point is demonstrating the ability to use both code-based and meaning-based information in interactive and confirmatory ways.
And at Johnson, stood still. There was a strange sound.
The video makes it clear that the child is building his sight vocabulary via effective word solving while reading, using meaning to support his efforts at word identification. Let's think for a second of what could happen if learners relied exclusively on the code, which is what the SOR proponents advocate. First of all, many words would not be accurately identified. Therefore, they wouldn't be added to the learner's sight vocabulary. And quite obviously, growth and knowledge of word meanings could be impaired. It's also likely that the texts that they're reading will not be well understood or comprehended if they encounter multiple unfamiliar words while reading. And as a result, the learner's knowledge base would not be expanded, and there is a risk that the learners could become passive about meaning construction. So because this conference is hosted by the Institute of Education Sciences, I do want to share some of the research that colleagues and I have done around this particular issue of guidance around word solving. In the recent issue of Reading Research Quarterly, a special issue on the science of reading, my colleague Kim Anderson and I discussed the role of context as an assist in word solving, summarizing multiple intervention studies that we had completed with learners in kindergarten through fourth grade, learners who were identified as having reading difficulties and who were engaged in learning about word solving using both code-based and meaning-based strategies. Exactly how the instructional intervention played out is described in some detail for the early literacy learners in a text that colleagues and I published in 2017. But one of the foundational pieces of that work is the strategy list that I've just pulled up on the screen. And this is a tool that we used with readers who were having difficulty and that many classroom teachers have found useful in supporting their early literacy learners. I'm not going to take the time to walk through all of the details of this particular resource, but I'll note that the strategies include some that encourage the reader to consider the alphabetic information in words that they are attempting to solve, and others that encourage them to draw on contextual information. And as I've said a couple of times now, our approach with kids is to encourage them to use context-based and code-based information in interactive and confirmatory ways, checking one source of information against the other. So in support of some of the arguments that I've been articulating, I do want to share a couple of the studies that were reviewed in our 2020 paper, two that are particularly relevant for the current topic. One, which involved a comparison of early intervention approaches that varied the amount of time spent on strategic word solving in context versus explicit instruction on phonological skills. So the manipulation in this study had to do with how much time was spent on the various components of the intervention lessons with kids that were in what we called text emphasis condition, which involved more time spent on strategic word solving. So in the text emphasis condition, children spent 15 of the minutes of the 30-minute session on reading and rereading text, and 5 minutes on each of the other components of the lesson. For kids who were in the phonological skills emphasis condition, the time spent reading and rereading was reduced to 5 minutes, and the phonological skills components of the lesson were increased to 15 minutes, the other two components being about the same. So there was a clear distinction in terms of how much time kids were engaged in the two sort of competing emphases in the instruction. In this study, we identified children who were at risk of experiencing literacy learning difficulties at kindergarten entry and provided half of the children from each participating school with small group intervention in kindergarten, twice a week for approximately 25 to 30 weeks. Children in the comparison group received whatever intervention services their schools offered. So our intervention included instruction to develop phonological skills and instruction and guidance in the use of the word-solving strategies illustrated on an earlier slide. At the beginning of first grade, all available study participants were reevaluated on early literacy skills. The composite score was calculated for each participant, and those falling below the midpoint of the distribution for the kindergarten intervention group were identified as being at continued risk at the beginning of first grade. And that was true for children both in our kindergarten intervention group and children in the comparison group. At the beginning of first grade, children falling below the cut point were randomly assigned to one of three conditions: a text emphasis condition, a phonological skills emphasis condition, or a condition in which the children received whatever the school normally offered to support first graders who were having reading difficulties. This resulted in 6 different groups of participants, half of which had participated in our kindergarten intervention. At the beginning of first grade, all of the groups were, on average, approximately equal on the basic skills cluster of the Woodcock, with average standard scores slightly below 70. The major question for the study was, of course, which of the intervention conditions would yield the strongest outcomes. So this first graph illustrates the percentage of students who continued to score below the 15th percentile at the end of first grade, a level which most would consider to be pretty seriously impaired. It's evident that children who participated in our kindergarten intervention program were substantially less likely to score below the 15th percentile than were children in the comparison group in kindergarten. It's also evident that the phonological skills emphasis condition yielded fewer children scoring below the 15th percentile. This might be taken as evidence that the phonological skills condition was more effective. However, in the next graph, we see the percentages of children in those same groups who scored above the 50th percentile. Here it is evident that the text emphasis condition was more effective in moving children who demonstrated early literacy difficulties into the average or better range on measures of foundational reading skills. That is, children who spent more time reading during intervention, which provided them with more opportunity to learn and apply code and meaning-based word-solving strategies, were more likely to perform in the average or better range. In another small study, Kim Anderson evaluated the effects of two different professional development offerings, a phonological skills focus and a strategic word-solving focus, both based on the professional development provided to teachers in the previous study. So the subjects in the study were first grade intervention teachers and students in their small intervention groups. The study ran from January to June. The children were given pre and post assessments, measures that were condition sensitive, and at post-test only, they were administered unpublished measures of oral reading accuracy and word reading. The professional development consisted of 1 day in-person PD, condition appropriate, with 2 pre-recorded condition-aligned follow-ups. We had the phonological skills emphasis condition and the strategic word-solving condition. So teachers who were participating in the study were advised to incorporate their new learning into their normal instructional routines, and it was a fairly low-cost professional development offering. And the outcomes were fairly clear in that the children whose teachers were in the strategic word-solving condition performed better on measures of reading accuracy. While both of these outcomes are in this small to moderate range in terms of the effect size, in light of the fact that the professional development offering was really quite brief, it's rather remarkable that such a difference would emerge. And I think attests to the utility of teaching kids to use both contextual and code-based information. So in working with teachers, I think a particularly important message to send is that the use and utility of the sources of information available to support word solving shifts as readers mature. Novice readers, developing readers, maturing readers all have different abilities and need different supports in order to engage in the reading process. Of course, our goal is that everyone will eventually become proficient readers. In thinking about novice readers, we need to keep in mind that they're learning foundational print concepts. They know little or nothing about the alphabetic code, and so they're going to rely heavily on pictures and predictable patterns in text. And hopefully, as they begin to learn about letters and sounds, they'll begin to attend to those letters and sounds as supports for their word-solving efforts. As children develop, they're learning more about the code. They tend to rely on partial alphabetic information in conjunction with contextual information to identify unfamiliar words. As they continue to mature and know a lot about the code, they begin to rely primarily on alphabetic information, which is certainly what we ultimately want to have happen so that they can store unfamiliar words in memory more thoroughly. And at this point, they'll be using context to direct and check hypotheses about words' identities and rethinking the word's identity based on any mismatches that may occur with context. Of course, ultimately, proficient readers effortlessly identify all or nearly all of the words they encounter in texts, and that enables them to focus pretty exclusively on the meaning of the text. So to wrap up this discussion, I wanted to share a few conclusions. One is that there's no evidence to support the SOR advocacy against teaching and encouraging children to use context as an assist in word solving. In the limited research that's been done to evaluate the role of encouraging context use, the evidence supports explicitly teaching children to use code and meaning-based strategies, but clearly more research needs to be done. Ideally, instructional guidance should be backed by research. I wanted to mention that the Institute of Education Sciences published descriptions of 4 ESSA tiers of research evidence, with Tier 1 being strong evidence, Tier 2 moderate, Tier 3 promising, and Tier 4 evidence that simply provides a rationale. Based on those tiers, at best, the SOR Advocacy's group position on the use of context meets the lowest tier. As noted, there doesn't appear to be any evidence in support of their position. Studies that my colleagues and I have done, and that are summarized in our RQ's special issue, provide at least tier 3 and possibly tier 2 levels of evidence in support of teaching young learners to use code and meaning-based strategies. And so to wrap up, I'd argue that there's reason to be concerned about the potential impact of the SOR position on the use of contextual supports in word solving. It seems clear that discouraging the use of context as an assist in word solving could have a negative impact on early literacy learners' growth and reading skills.
Hello, and welcome back. We're now in the live Q&A portion of this session. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Scanlon, for your thought-provoking presentation on what is the research support for the science of reading's position on the use of contextual supports in word identification and word learning. That was really excellent. So the floor is now open for questions for Dr. Scanlon. If you have any questions, please type them in a chat box on your screen, and I will ask them directly of her. We have our first question. Dr. Scanlon, how did you develop an interest in early literacy instruction and prevention, which has led to your research on this important topic today?
That's a long story, but it really goes back many years. I, in high school, was a tutor in a community center for young literacy learners who were having difficulty, and that really got me very interested in what was the reason for those difficulties, and so much so that as my senior thesis in high school English, I wrote a paper on precocious literacy learners. So it goes back a long time. But luckily for me, given my interests, I ended up just by chance when I was at the University at Albany as an undergraduate, being assigned as a work study student at a center that was doing research on reading and reading difficulties, which was directed by Frank Valutino, who some will recognize as somebody who's had a lot to say about early literacy difficulties. And he and I have been colleagues for decades.
Great, thank you. We have another question. So, Dr. Scanlon, based on the position that the science of reading proponents are currently taking, can you please expand on how you think this issue might be resolved, and what are some of the challenges ahead?
Well, I think that one of the issues is that we need to do more research. It's really sort of more than a little bit concerning that we would be seeing this shift in thinking in terms of how we support kids' word learning without any research that I could find or that anybody could direct me to, and indicating that that's a more positive and useful approach to supporting kids. The problem, an area that I'm a little bit worried about relative to that kind of research is that these little guys only have, 1 year in first grade, hopefully, or 1 year in kindergarten, one short period of time where they're learning about the reading process. And if we turn their attention away from attending to meaning, from having the skills needed to build their sight vocabulary, as I said at the end of the presentation, we may be having a net negative impact. And so I'm not sure that I would be comfortable doing research that pitted don't teach the kids to use context-based strategies versus teaching the kids to use both context and code and efforts at word solving. So I think that's a real challenge going forward.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. That's very, very interesting. We have another question from a participant, Julia. She says that there seems to be a lot of buzz in the science of reading community about the 3 cueing system and linking the 3 cueing system to the use of contextual clues. So what are your thoughts on and knowledge of the evidence for or against the 3 cueing system?
It's an interesting question. The three queuing system, in case there are folks on this session that don't know about that system, it involves using three different sources of information, three different sources of information in an effort to solve unfamiliar words encountered in context. And the sources are meaning. Does the word make sense? Syntax, which is, does it sound right in the current situation? And then the last is visual, which I would call alphabetics or phonics, which is basically using the alphabetic code and orthographic information. So that approach has been part of the early literacy instruction scenery for a very long time. To my knowledge, it's never been explicitly tested, but it certainly aligns with what I'm saying, which is kids need to use both the context and the code. I wouldn't necessarily make a distinction between the M or the meaning and the syntax, because I think they're hard to separate for kids. But the concern, I think, with the MSV or the three queuing system is that sometimes kids get the message, whether intended or not, that they should privilege meaning over code, that they should pay more attention to what would make sense than to what the orthographic and alphabetic information suggests. And so they don't look at the words thoroughly enough to store the orthographic representation in memory so that words are more familiar to them in a subsequent encounter with those same words. So I think that's the main issue, is that there's concern that kids will pay so much attention to the meaning that they don't pay sufficient attention to the code.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scanlon. We have another audience question. So based on a dearth of research support for the science of reading position on use of context, do you have a hypothesis on how or why the science of reading position is gaining so much traction in state legislative education efforts?
I do have a sense that the folks who support the science of reading position are highly organized, highly committed. They're passionate. They really believe that this is the answer to reading problems. And to a great extent, I think the problem is that we are largely, that people who sort of think about these things the way I do, we haven't been organized. We haven't sort of been out there articulating our concerns about this particular issue. It's one of the reasons why I agreed to do this talk today. It's one of the reasons why we wrote that piece for RRQ. I really do think that many of us have been too silent on this topic, and it's really gained traction that it ideally would have never gained.
Great. We have another question. Did your research on the interactive strategies approach take into consideration English language learners and how they approach word identification and word learning?
In the area where we did most of our research at the time that this research was being done, there weren't high concentrations of English language learners. And so we never did have the opportunity to study the approach with that group. In the interim, or since we stopped doing our early literacy research, we have done professional development in school districts that have high concentrations of English learners. And it's anecdotal. We don't have, solid research evidence, but the reports are that it works well for kids who are English learners as well. But it, needless to say, will depend on their command of the English language. So there is an area of research that is needing to be attended to.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that. There is another question. On what source or sources do you base your interpretation of the science of reading position on use of context?
That's a really good question, because there's a lot of debate about what is the science of reading. And certainly there are many people who would argue that what's represented in the popular press is a very limited view of what constitutes the sciences of reading. And so the sources that I base that argument on, that they're arguing against the use of context, are mostly what's represented in the popular press. And that's because that's what so many people are hearing, and so many decision makers at the state level and on down are being guided by. And so again, my efforts today are about letting folks know that there is not good evidence to support that claim.
Okay, let's see. I have a couple more questions, Dr. Scanlon. In terms of the field of reading in other languages, how has your research impacted that? Has there been any impact? Do you know?
In other languages, I don't have any knowledge that anybody has attempted it, but I think that that some languages are much more regular in terms of the correspondence between the pronunciations of words and their spellings. And some might argue that in those languages, and there is evidence that in languages like Italian, for example, that kids will learn to identify words more quickly because of that close correspondence between print and pronunciation. But nevertheless, we want to make sure that kids are always checking to make sure they're attempted at a word. It actually is a real word that fits the context. So I'm not familiar with any research, but there are differences among languages in terms of the correspondences between print and language, or spoken language.
Thank you very much for that. What are you currently working on that is an extension of your research in this area?
Right now, a lot of what I'm doing is trying to respond to some of the things that are emerging in the field that are not supported by research, and really trying to understand where those things like this don't use context as a support, where those things are coming from, and what we might be able to do to sort of broaden the conversation so people are not convinced by certain things. For example, one of the things that's really concerning me these days, and that I'm actively working on, is the current push to screen children for dyslexia in the early primary grades. And there's a big push, again, well organized, very active in trying to convince state legislatures to that we should be screening kindergarten, first grade children for dyslexia. And there's no support for doing that for the purpose of identifying whether a child might be at risk for dyslexia. In fact, dyslexia is a contested construct. There are people who say, everybody's got a different definition of dyslexia and so on. My concern right now relative to that screening issue is that the research on multi-tiered systems of support and RTI are all designed around the notion that some kids get off to a slow start with literacy development and need to be identified for sure as being in need of intervention. And then they need to be given a lot of support, the amount of support that they seem to need in order to sort of close the gap with their peers. And in many cases, that early identification of those in need of intervention and the provision of intervention results in most kids catching up and not needing long-term support, and certainly not qualifying, depending on what your definition of dyslexia is, not qualifying by conventional, I don't even know what the conventions are these days, but what constitutes what qualifies a child as dyslexic. But I am really worried about kids being identified in the early primary grades as being at risk for dyslexia on very brief assessments. And when the real issue is who needs more help, and let's make sure they get it, and that the help is supportive of what they need.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting. Now, in your decades of experience, Dr. Scanlon, what do you think is the greatest challenge in the field of reading? You know, and in terms of the research that you are working on, like what is the greatest challenge for you personally?
I think the greatest challenge is the idea that we can come up with programs that need to be delivered with sort of fidelity, that, you know, every child should be getting X, whatever that program is, and that's going to solve the reading problem. Kids are individuals. Every child is, I often say, every child is ready to learn something, but they're not all ready to learn the same things. Our job as educators, especially for the little guys, is to figure out what kids understand, what they are ready to learn, and to teach that. But there's often a sense that every child should be that the program should be delivered with fidelity, I guess, is probably the greatest concern. And that's been around for a long time. I heard some of the earlier talks today where that doesn't seem to be such a common thread, and that's a great relief.
So one last question, Dr. Scanlon, because we're running out of time. In terms of large-scale assessments, right? And in terms of what you just said, how are large-scale assessments, I mean, do they even help to identify students who are, you know, who have difficulty reading? And
I don't know that they help to identify individuals so much as they help to identify trends. And, you know, it's reasonable to identify trends. But we can't go for a one-size-fits-all fix for trends that are observed. For example, I was involved with the evaluation of the Reading First initiative, which was a sort of what I'd call a heavy-duty phonics intervention done on a broad scale. What we learned from that large experiment was that teaching heavy-duty, you know, really emphasizing phonics skills in the K3 grade range did result in better decoding skills, but had no apparent impact on what we care about most as literacy educators, which is the children's ability to comprehend, learn from, and enjoy the things they read.
Thank you very, very much. We are running out of time. Any last parting words, Dr. Scanlon?
I would encourage people who are involved in making decisions about literacy education to really look for research evidence before adopting programs. This instance with don't use context is a big thing. There are other trends that just sort of gain prominence and get taken up without any evidence that they're actually going to be beneficial for kids. And that, I think, is a real tragedy that's happened over and over again.
True. Well, we've run out of time. So thank you very, very much, Dr. Scanlon. And thank you, everyone, for participating. Enjoy the rest of the conference. And be sure to join us for the closing plenary session today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joanne.